the importance of oil is widely misunderstood, downplayed or ignored in just about all spheres of public debate. The current global crisis is primarily a struggle over the control of oil reserves. World War I and World War II were themselves primarily oil wars, even though they are almost never presented and analyzed as such. When historians tackle the causes of World War I, they usually focus on the alliances of the period, on events in the Balkans, competition for colonies between the European powers, the naval build-up between Britain and Germany, or Russia's military modernization program. However, they usually fail to mention the oil situation of the time. By the early 20th century, it was already abundantly clear that oil would be the energy source of the future. The British Royal Navy started the process of shifting from coal-powered ships to oil. The U.S. car industry was already producing almost 1 million cars a year, supply trucks were already replacing horses and mules, while aircraft were already being invented, manufactured and adopted by the air forces of the major powers. Out of the major powers of the time, Germany was the one more sorely lacking in oil, and painfully well aware that the US, Russia and the British Empire were in a far better situation regarding access to oil. Germany's Ottoman allies still controlled Iraq at the time, which was precisely why right before World War I broke out in Europe, the Germans had almost completed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. The British, on the other hand, already in control of modern-day Iran, were already extracting oil from southwestern Iran and were poised to make a move for Basra in southern Iraq, against Germany's Turkish allies. At the same time, Russia was the number 2 oil producer in the world, behind only the United States. Russia's oil production was then concentrated in the southern Caucasus, a region that was conquered by the Russians at the expense of the Ottomans and Persians during the early part of the 19th century. Both the Turks and the Germans were fixated on this oil-rich region. Even though it would be excessive to claim that World War I was caused exclusively by competition for oil reserves, it's certainly the least well discussed out of all likely causes. During the interwar period, the importance of oil grew even more, as the mechanization of everything, from agriculture, to public transport, to warfighting was proceeding at a rapid pace. Both Germany and Japan perceived their lack of oil as a fundamental strategic weakness and were devising plans on how to remedy their situation. The Germans were fixated on Russian and Middle Eastern oil, while the Japanese were determined to take over Shell's oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. The Japanese did in fact manage to capture the Dutch East Indies in their oil fields and refineries, but could not make the most out of it, as America's formidable submarine fleet managed to sink most Japanese oil tankers during the next few years of the war. The Germans fared even worse when it came to conquer oil-producing regions. In 1942, the German High Command prioritized the southern sector on its eastern front, hoping to reach the oil fields of Baku, but this effort ultimately ended with a disastrous defeat for the Germans and their European allies at Stalingrad, after which they had to withdraw hundreds of miles to the west as their hold on Russian oil fields proved to be exceedingly brief. The Germans, along with their Italian allies, tried to use North Africa as a springboard to the Middle East and its oil, but were ultimately defeated by Anglo-American forces. Germany's only substantial oil source during World War II ended up being Romania with its Ploiesti fields. The Germans and their Romanian allies went to great lengths in defending these precious oil facilities and inflicted one of the worst defeats in the history of the U.S. Air Force on August 1943 during the latter's ill-fated Operation Tidal Wave, which was a risky attempt at destroying the Ploiesti oil production facilities and refineries. The Romanian oil fields came back to haunt the Germans, when in the summer of 1944, they prioritized their defense, instead of that of Army Group Center in Belarus and Poland, as they wrongly guessed the next Soviet offensive, resulting to their most devastating defeat in the entire war, during Operation Bagration. During the final months of the war, the Germans introduced jet-powered aircraft, but lacked the fuel to use them effectively, while on the other side of the world, the Japanese were forced to use kamikaze tactics, again due to lack of fuel. So, in brief, World War II was a desperate and brutal attempt by both the Germans and the Japanese to acquire the oil reserves they lacked, and were ultimately defeated, primarily due to this very lack of oil reserves at their disposal. This vital lesson of World War II has never been forgotten by any major state. Clearly, oil is the most vital resource in the modern world. Despite the availability of other sources of energy, some of them cheaper, such as coal and natural gas, only oil fulfills the criteria for full-spectrum usability. Oil is the easiest of all fuels to transport and store, and can be utilized in just about any capacity. From powering private cars, to trucks, agricultural equipment, mechanizing entire militaries, shipping, trains, aircraft, power generation, heating, petrochemicals production, and more. No other fuel, be it mineral, nuclear, or renewable, can remotely satisfy all these various requirements. Multi-decade efforts at replacing oil have only yielded success in the areas of electricity generation and heating. During the past 15 years or so, there has also been a massive and extremely costly effort by Americans, Europeans and Chinese, to shift part of their respective private car fleets into electricity. The costs have been massive, while the results have been fairly limited, as the example of electric vehicle poster child, Norway, has very well proven. Multi-decade-long efforts at replacing and economizing oil from just about every single country on the planet, even the precious few that have an abundance of it, have manifestly failed at reducing its overall consumption. On the contrary, oil consumption at the global level has been relentlessly rising, even if at a somewhat slow pace of just over 1% per year for the past few decades. The importance of oil is not just about the fact that it is the one resource that allows economic potential to actually materialize, but becomes even more crucial and strategic once we consider the fact that oil reserves are extremely unevenly distributed throughout the world. Lots of countries may be small or medium-sized producers, yet the crux of the matter is that only 2 regions of the globe actually enjoy significant oil abundance and are therefore able to export in significant volumes and over the long term. These 2 regions are the Middle East, and specifically the Persian Gulf, and Russia/Kazakhstan. The flip side of this is that all other parts of the globe, where the vast majority of the world's population reside and economic activity takes place, are either barely breaking even, such as the Americas and Africa, or suffer from extreme oil deficits, such as the Indo-Pacific, which is by far the world's most populous and economically important region, and Europe. Just to give a brief overview of the current global oil situation, I would simply draw attention to the fact that both China and India, far and away the world's most populous nations, are extremely dependent on oil imports, as they can only produce a rather small fraction of their daily needs, around 25% for China, and around 13% for India. And as these countries develop further, this oil deficit continues to grow. Moreover, the entirety of Europe is severely lacking in oil, as is the case with Turkey, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and the Philippines. In short, virtually all U.S. allies across Eurasia are extremely poor when it comes to oil. Beyond China, India and the U.S. alliance system, several other heavyweight countries also find themselves in a deficient oil balance. Many countries with huge populations and in dire need of further economic development, such as Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh and Vietnam, are by now rather significant and growing oil importers. Oil's incomparable importance to the global balance of power only becomes clear when we conceptually combine 4 key concepts. A. Oil is the master resource, without which economic potential, however advanced, is rendered useless. B. Oil reserves are extremely unevenly distributed throughout the world. Most countries and populations are oil poor. C. Oil fields deplete, and most oil-producing countries have entered long-term terminal decline. D. Only 2 world regions have a genuine abundance of oil, together they form the aptly named strategic ellipse.